Good morning, good afternoon, good evening if you're in Asia where I am. So that's well into good evening. So thank you very much for joining today. Um, I'm Jerry George. I'm a professor of innovation entrepreneurship. I've got two roles at this time. I was a professor on leave. I am a professor on leave at from Georgetown University, McDonough School of Business. And now I've taken on as group managing director of IMU, which is International Medical University in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. So I'm what you would say running a university which is focused, a specialist university focused on health. This concept of One Health, that's human, animal, and environmental health, and with over 4,500 students, hospitals, healthcare, service delivery, and so forth. So that's basically what I do. Um, this, I'm sure there are plenty of you here who've already been discussing this topic for some time. So I don't want to presume that I know this topic best. So I'll start the conversation with the idea that this truly does become a conversation around this topic. Um, Really, if you look back at what I've been doing, this topic maybe is about for the past 15 years, I've been working on and off on sort of the interface between public and private and how you can use that uh, sort of that leverage to solve global problems or what I'd call grand challenges, right? And with that, my latest book, Venture Meets Mission, it came out in January, so I'll talk a little bit about this, but I've set this up as a combination of papers and topics and research questions. And my big takeaway for today really is that I'd like us as a community to be enthused about this potential of working on this interface between public and private and to solve grand challenges, right? How can we leverage what I call the scale and purpose of government with the creativity and capabilities of private enterprise, right? So that's the whole idea. And with that comes this whole rethinking of what an academic career should be, what you as an individual could think about, and how we all design our career choices and research questions and things like that. And maybe this could help us sort of energize some of that discussion around the topic we choose to study and why we choose to study those topics, right? So with that, let me first thank RRBM for organizing this. Ibrahim, thank you very much for your persistence and also scheduling and getting all of this underway. So thank you very much for you, everybody being here. And I can't see who's attending. So if some of your papers are being discussed or something, please feel free to jump in and voice your opinion on this, right? So let me just start with the sort of basic sort of premise. And the basic premise is this, that the way governments are solving problems is changing, right? And I'm going to talk about three underlying sort of issues here. The first one is the governments and governing itself has changed, right? So time for policy making is drastically reduced. So if you take, for example, the US, and I'll keep that as a common example if people understand that. Um, if you take appointments of senior sort of staff members in, let's say, Department of whichever defense, uh, it takes about 2 years to get the president's nominees to be cleared. And that individual has about a 2 year window to actually make any impact in the policy making and the decisions that they make, right? So the time frame in which governments can actually make an impact has become shorter, right? What that also means with all this other politics of what I call the politics of polarization, which means people are betting more ideologically rather than, and so it's harder to get to a middle ground consensus of picking what I call moonshots, like in the same way that John F. Kennedy did of sending a man to the moon and bringing him back safely, right? That's the idea. So, so given that this geopolitics of competition, of technology, all of this has made sort of the process of governing different, right? It's changed. So what that means then is that governments require what I call greater agility in their model of how they structure the enterprise itself, right? The organization, and the speed in which they make decisions. So if you have a short window to make an impact, then you better well be organized to deliver that impact. That's one. A second big underlying trend here is also that the nature of problems have become more complex. So governments used to build roads, hospitals. So now that they've built that the demands of them have become more complex because the nature of services delivered through them is becoming more complex, right? So if you look at healthcare delivery now through the public hospital system, it's far more complex. And let's say COVID has made a big difference in how such healthcare is delivered as well. That service delivery, the cost of service delivery, the cost of managing drugs, the cost of managing care, acute care, all of this has changed, right? And has become more complicated. So what this means is whether it's healthcare, whether it's climate change or tackling homelessness and immigration, the public good problems have become what I call more interconnected and more interdependent. That means so you can't just solve one issue by itself. You have to take a cluster of them together and create that ecosystem of solutions and actors to make that work. And in all of this, given what's going on, the public sector, the talent pool that the public sector attracts has become narrow. And there's a lot of evidence for this across the world, that the types of people who go into public sector have become more channeled over time. That's because business has become a lot more competitive and a lot more financially attractive, that it takes a certain person to go into the public sector, and that person might not stay there long enough for that individual to make a difference. So what that also means is that there are gaps in capabilities, resources, and what I call imagination, really about problem solving is how can we get that private sector creativity into the public sector space? In all of this, then, societal trust has shifted. If you look at there's an Edelman Trust Barometer study survey that goes on every year. And that survey now indicates that business is the most trusted social institution above governments and other things like Supreme Courts and police and all of those things. That institutional infrastructure that we take for granted as protecting us and keeping us safe and doing as why we should trust these institutions has now gone lower than businesses. That's right. So if you go 20, 30 years back, businesses were not in that position. You would talk about universities, religious institutions, governments having far more sort of the recipient of trust than business was. Now it's changed, right? And now CEOs, if you look at whether it's the Business Roundtable or any of these sort of organizations which come together, the CEOs are increasingly in a position where they have to comment and act on social issues. It's the consumers expect it, their staff members expect it. So it becomes sort of a galvanizing force for CEOs to feel that they need to be involved. And so you also see at the same time, a lot of organizations have reframed their sort of vision statement into language that's about purpose and it's about making a difference and so forth, right? So a lot of CEOs, leaders now couch their sort of public mission within a purpose sort of argument, right? And so what that has enabled really is this conversation where businesses are now entering what which would typically be considered a public opportunity space, right? So, for example, if you talk about in very simple ways, if you talk about a venture cleaning up plastic from the oceans, uh, typically that would have been thought about as something that a government would do rather than a private enterprise doing that. And and because now there are opportunities where private sector can capture some of that public value through private rents or make money off of it, now it's becoming seen as quite legitimate for private enterprise and entrepreneurial companies to enter what is typically seen as public opportunities, right? Public good spaces. So there's a lot going on here, but really it's that frame setting where we say the governments are changing so fast, not stable enough. And so what happens is that you need to make decisions quickly if you want to have impact. That creates a specific pathology in itself, but the challenge is now the government structures have to be a lot more agile and quick in responding. But it also means that governments have been losing talent over decades. Most governments have been, right? And so, how do you then figure out what the gaps are in capabilities and how do you bridge those gaps? Because technologies are changing, and so governments need to adapt into this new environment, right? And businesses now feel that there is a remit and there is a space for them to be involved. So if you, there's the citation for our paper below. It's a journal of management paper that just came out this month, where we do a review of sort of partnering or public-private sort of partnerships, right? Broadly, different partnerships models. And we call that public-private collaborations because this typical idea of public-private partnership in the 1970s comes out because of putting roads in, building dams, and so forth, where these are long-term projects, about 30 years, and where you have some kind of model where you build, operate, and transfer, or then make money out of it, right? So those are long-term contracts, and typically they're taken by large organizations who have the capability and the financial capital to do engage in this, right? Now that whole model is changing. Now, in public, if you see this simple figure here, on the left-hand top corner, you've got corporatization, meaning that they are public bureaucracies in some form. And at the very bottom right corner, you've got private sort of enterprises acting with public support. So here, while you go from left to right or top to bottom in the angle, you would see that the private sector scope increases. And so what we've seen now over the past decade or two is that this hybrid between that public-private interface has expanded. That what used to be done by what we call state-owned enterprises is now spilling over into service contracts, into lease, concession contracts, and so forth. Think about prison services. Was a public sort of clearly a public function before. Now most prisons are operated by private operators, right? So there are huge changes in how this has happened. So what we see is that private enterprises are providing a lot more of public services, right? And then the responsibility in all of these has also changed, right? So when you start asking this question, who is responsible for what service when there's that interface? So in terms of liability, in terms of responsiveness to stakeholder demands, or in terms of understanding, identifying what the outcomes should be and who should pay for it. So all of these become a bit more grayer than it used to be before, right? And so this is not something that happened overnight, but it's been happening over time. And what we see now is that there's an acceleration in private enterprise in these spaces. So, for example, um, if NASA used to send rockets out into space, now the SpaceX and everybody else is doing it, right? What has done that is NASA now supports SpaceX through resources for them to put uh, to send out rockets, right? And so now you see that the shift in who's acting for the government and what are their responsibilities is also one that has to be concretized and contracted, right? So this raises issues like what is goal alignment? What is a successful outcome? Under what time frame is this an appropriate outcome? So sort of all of these range of uncertainties that come from there, right? So that interface between public and private, because the nature of collaborations is increased, now there are a lot of questions about how you design this and what are the organizational design considerations in all of that. If you look at Ostrom's design principles, you might have read the paper by Brito and Stolhurst in AMR 2022, uh, and so they sort of categorize these 9 design principles. But Ostrom's work, you could look at a book, highlights these sort of principles on what we call collective good problems or common resource pool problems, right? And here she lists these 9 sort of principles, right? Boundaries, division of joint value, participation in decision making, monitoring, sanctions, conflict resolution, right to organize, and polycentricity. These 9 design principles creates these tensions within that public-private interface. That is, who participates and benefits from joint value creation? How are rules made? Who regulates this, right? Um, how do you, who owns the data when when you're delivering a public service? And what are the sort of compliance to these rules, right? What happens if ventures misbehave, right? In this, or parties misbehave, or parties don't whether it's the government or private, uh, that they don't stick with what they had promised, right? So there are all of these type of issues that come that we need to think about in how we address these common resource problems, right? So we've just got a paper accepted a week ago with Satish Nambazana and I, which we publish in Information Systems Research, ISR, and sort of in the information systems side, where we sort of map these what we call collective action problems and what are tensions and how digital sort of approaches can help sort of address or begin to unravel some of these tensions that exist, right? So if we think about it more closely, what we are really doing is saying that here are broad design principles. Here are some of the tensions that arise, whether it's global or local or public or private. What we're talking about is the interface between these two, and then what are solutions that come to address that, right? So in this case, because it's ISR, we talk about specific technologies and approaches to address that. So if you're interested in sort of the digital sustainability area and thinking about how digital solutions can influence sustainability problems, then this would be a good paper to go over. But really, the crux of this is what I put here: the design principles and the tensions they create at the public-private interface, and how you solve it could differ, right? So really, the focus then becomes how do we solve public good problems by sort of reimagining or examining very closely the public-private interface, right? I could state it in different ways. I could say it as, how can we think of um, businesses participating in solving public good problems in a way that's beneficial for private enterprise? And this is very important in terms of language to be a bit more precise, because when we think of an enterprise with a social mission, we automatically sort of badge it as a social enterprise. But what I'm saying is exactly not that at all. What I'm saying is that you could be a for-profit enterprise now and solve social mission problems, right, without having to trade off this idea of impact and profitability, right? So with that, that comes to our latest book, that was also released in January. So the 3 or 4 papers that I'm talking about are all out in January. So January, this last month has been a very good month that way. So this idea here is, in Venture Meets Mission, is really this: how can we harness the creativity and capability of enterprise, which is we call venture, combined with the scale and purpose of government? Right? We differentiate between purpose and mission, because purpose is what we consider that to be internal. So it is internal to the actor. It's my purpose is. It could be anything. It need not be saving the world. It could, you could have a purpose to make a lot of money, and that's okay, right? So for us, we then say this idea of mission, though, is is this about collective good. It's about solving problems for community and society. And that typically falls in the realm of government, right? So the scale and purpose of government is really the size and access and reach of government. And the purpose is about bringing communities together, rebuilding trust in society, and energizing the economy in different ways. And so then the idea here is, how do private enterprises rethink this whole set of slew of interventions, which we call public-private partnerships, to be completely different and novel and innovative and agile ways to solve public good problems, right? So that's what we cover in this book. Arun Gupta, my co-author is Arun Gupta. Arun is uh, a venture capital private equity guy. He's now an adjunct professor at Georgetown, and is teaching this course at Stanford called um, Valley Mission, right? I just forgot the word. So then we came together and said, hey, we should talk about how entrepreneurship or the growth ventures are now involved in this space, right? Earlier, we used to think they're all for these old, big, large defense companies like McDonnell Douglas or Raytheon or whatever, right? Or Boeing. But now we think that a lot of tech ventures have entered into this space, working with government to solve social mission problems collaboratively, without having this knee-jerk reaction of putting government in one corner on the other side, and the California Silicon Valley model on the other, as polar opposites. Instead, now there's this growing convergence of how these ventures, the power of ventures, can come together and meet the purpose of government, right? And we use a lot of case studies and talk about these issues. But there, really, in that book, we cover a few issues. One is that we need to work harder at rebuilding trust between government, civil society, and business. And so we, in this image here, we sort of put government and what the role of government does. Government as an enabler of trust, orchestrator of mission, developer of talent, which is very important, mobilizer of capital, and procurer of value. If you look at that five roles, most of the time we would think of governments as procurers of value because of their purchasing contract, their purchasing power. So many governments across the world, for example, reserve 10% of their purchases towards small businesses, right? So that's just procurer of value. Mobilizer of capital is, you could see that in the US in the CHIPS Act, where the government puts a lot of money towards enabling a technology ecosystem in the production of chips. It goes into also areas such as climate change mitigation and so forth, right? So there is a huge amount of capital that the government is able to mobilize to galvanize private capital and supplement it that for investment. Right? That's not just in the US. In the UK, it's the same thing. So the UK recently put, uh, many governments are putting these investment funds that go alongside private capital to really think about that value of death problem in deep technologies that include AI and so forth, right? So how can we build our technological competitiveness by putting capital in spaces where private capital think it's too risky at this time to take on that? Developer of talent, of course, is one. We think of governments paying in the public school systems pretty much free for everybody till year 12, right? And then you go into university. But really, the government is invested all along in a public sector education, in public education, right? And so it's invested in building capabilities in terms of building talent. But then after university, everybody goes off into private sector. Right? So how can you bring back that whole piece where you energize people to think about government as an equal, equally interesting opportunity for them to develop their careers, and that fluidity between going into government and working with private sector and going back in that same way, right? Orchestrator of mission, it's very clear, sort of developing and let's say an industrial policy in identifying sort of grand challenge sort of ideas of how technologies are going to develop or what we're going to do in a specific sector such as health. And all of this is about enabler of trust, transparency, enforcing justice, all of these things. So we sort of say that this idea of a liberal democracy means that the there is this idea of individual freedoms to carry out innovation, enterprise, and so forth, a limited power of government, and strong and stable social institutions. And that's the fundamental idea of a liberal democracy. What we see now as trust is failing is that many of these functions are being questioned. So now where really this whole impetus comes is the government starts to rethink how we can rebuild trust in society, and ventures have a part to play in that. There are different strategies we talk about in how ventures can work with governments, and part of that is really about understanding in an org design sense, mutual knowledge, sort of understanding how the language of government works, right? Understanding how policy making is developed, and then working within that framework to make it better. And of course, civil society, we talk about talent and the role of universities and how our talent system in terms of how we encourage our kids uh, to go into technology and so forth. We don't think about the government sector or the working on the interface of public and private to solve these problems, right? So we think of those as um, going to California and going to Silicon Valley is really cool, but going to DC is not, right? So there is this whole bias in how we frame these issues. But now if you'll come to Virginia, and on the whole DC area, you would see that there are a lot more tech companies there than there were 10 years ago, right? So that whole ecosystem is shifting, and our research has not quite caught up or leapt into that or taken that as an opportunity. So really what I'm getting to is that there is a virtuous cycle at the public-private interface, right? So, so you can start at any point in this. You can start with saying, let's think of ways in which public-private collaborations can be structured. And you can apply it to emerging sectors or new opportunities. Let's say satellite imagery, right? And how we think of using that data. Now, that emerging sector, whether it's space, climate change, biosecurity, could also be defense, but all of these areas where now private sector or in growth ventures are being involved in, and technology in AI has made a lot of these things possible. These new sectors then create more case studies of success. And so that creates that positive momentum for venture capital to put in money, entrepreneurs to see that there are other successful entrepreneurs who work at that interface of public and private, and then that drives talent. And with that talent comes this fluidity between government, civil society, and venture. That movement then becomes important. So as academics, we think of, hey, I have to go into university and stay there for 30, 40 years, and many stay in the same university for 30, 40 years. Maybe there is a different way to rethink that fluidity that we talk about in moving between this public and private interface in how we conceptualize our own careers. So this is my last slide, really, and I frame this as a quest for success, and I frame this as a quest for personal success. As an academic and as a researcher and a scholar, you start thinking about what am I really interested in, and why do I do the work that I do, right? To find meaning and purpose in what we do is really about finding the mission aspect of your work, right? I've been energized by it. My co-authors are energized by it. And Arun and Tom have joined and created an entity called Noble Reach Foundation, which works with the government in developing a pipeline of innovative talent to enter into government service, right? So this is taking the best kids out of the top universities around and funneling them and giving them opportunities in public service. That same sort of approach then can be thought about in how we think of talent, right? So as an academic. So the first part I'd sort of re-emphasize again is that the phenomena that we are studying is changing rapidly. New technology, emerging sectors, agriculture and food, water, sort of the nexus of these, climate change, climate action, biosecurity, defense, space, all of these, AI, all of these are different technologies, different emerging spaces that were not there 10 years ago in the same level that we see now. And that should make us rethink sort of what am I doing as a scholar at the forefront of these areas? And am I actually engaging in these conversations that's going to shape the future of humanity as we think about it over the coming decades? So I've already been in academia for close to 30 years, so I don't have 30 years ahead of me. But if you're starting now, you have 30 years ahead of you. And then you should start thinking, am I looking at the same old questions in the same old sectors, or have I started thinking about old questions in these emerging sectors or new questions that are framed by these emerging sectors, right? And that's the important part. So I really want to emphasize that as a big takeaway. We're also at the age where there is government enthusiasm for private enterprise to be involved. Industrial policy now in different countries, because of the competitiveness, the geopolitics of competition, different countries are coming up and saying, where are we going to invest to build our capabilities? So as an academic, are we engaging in those discussions where the future of our countries and future of a collective global um, sort of progress rests, right? So at the same time, I'm an entrepreneurship professor. So I think of venture as entrepreneurial growth ventures. And always earlier, we used to think about B2C and B2B as the only spaces that you would operate in. But now you see this emerging space, which is fantastically lucrative and possible to make big growth ventures in this, in the B2G and B2G2C spaces, right? As the government sort of relies more on the private sector technology to make it more agile and deliver public services, then private enterprises then grow with the need with the government. So, and now these arrangements, which used to be long 30-year contracts, they're also changing. I just put it as three C's: coupons to credit to capital, right? But really, there's a lot more in between that the types of arrangements that governments now use across the world is phenomenal. Um, but then, while the phenomena are changing, the challenges still remain, right? This idea of goals and incentive alignment, who gets to a voice and who gets heard in stakeholder engagement, who creates value and how do you capture part of that value, right? In a commons sort of argument, let's say in climate action. This idea of regulation and control. When the technology becomes complex and the government does not have the capability to monitor that technology, how do you regulate and control these technologies, right? Um, so we are now discussing regulating AI, and EU has been the first, the European Union has been the first to issue a set of regulations governing AI use, right? But even that falls short as AI itself changes the tools and applications and what we can do. So in an emerging space where the government lags in technological capability, what does regulation and control look like with private enterprise engaging in this, right? Then alongside that comes all of these myriad sets of issues. They're challenges, but they're also opportunities for us to figure out how do we structure and govern temporary arrangements and mission projects. So the temporary arrangements is really about, it's no longer 30-year public-private sort of contracts, but it could be short, it could be 2 years, 3 years, it could just be for 3 months, in how private enterprise, certain skills come in, are integrated, and then exit in that space. And governments, given the speed, the slow speed in which they make regulation, the slow speed with which they enact policies and implement sort of purchasing and any of these things, what can they put in place to become more agile as the 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 sort of the at the intersectionality of that public and private, right? So there are big challenges here for us to think about and for us to engage in. And what we need really is a new breed of the academic mind, right? Um, with immersion, and I say this with immersion because we need to understand the language of both entities for us to see how do we operate in the interface between these two. And as private enterprise becomes more important in solving public good problems, how can we as academics facilitate, enable, encourage, all the words about making the world better is because we can provide study and give evidence of what is effective and under what conditions would this likely work, right? So with that, I'm going to close and open up for discussion if that's good, right? Thank you very much. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Jerry. Yeah, there have been some questions in the chat, and I would really welcome those people who wrote the question in the chat function to post those questions directly to you. Just so we can see you, please, can you click on the raise hand function, and that way we will call you. All right, Dia was first. Go ahead, Dia.
Thank you, Dr. Gerard. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. I have a question regarding, because I think I often consider like mission-driven venture as a kind of from the private side. So this is very new and interesting to me to see it from the governmental side. So my question is, what's your opinion about like the difference between like the private side of mission-driven ventures and from the public side, especially when it comes to purpose? Because I see from your slides that you kind of mentioned like the government side can provide purpose, while the private ventures, they are providing innovative solutions. But to my understanding, there's also a lot of people considering like firms, private firms or NGOs. They are also like purposeful organizations. They have their own purpose. And we see sometimes, I am considering probably there's conflicts between purposes from like organizations and governments. And that actually happens a lot. And especially for governments' way of functioning, sometimes if there is a problem comes out, it's probably because government has a top-down power to enforce the purpose. So I kind of been curious about your opinions about what do you think is the difference there, and how can we be more like immune or prepared for that kind of conflicts when it comes out? Thank you.
So thank you very much. That's a fantastic question there. So there are a couple of ways to think about it, right? The first one is that we should assume that not all governments are equally benign, right? So we assume that all governments have that same idea of purpose and mission and so forth. So this idea that all governments are equally benign is not true. So you're right in the sense that the greater the focused power in these governments to enforce, then that sort of stymies this idea of innovation that comes from individual organizations that build it, right? So clearly we have to be cognizant that we shouldn't take the assumption for granted that all government mission would be benign, right? That's one. The second one is that when we think of the role of the interface between public and private, there is bound to be the differences in what we call goal alignment. In fact, that's the first design principle problem that Ostrom talks about in terms of what are the boundaries and who's responsible and what conflicts are likely to come from these kind of problems, right? But that's not a new type of problem. Those problems have existed for a long period of time. Now, what we have to understand is what's changed in that context that then makes us think about new ways that the government is framing these problems, or new ways in the private sector is helping address these problems, right? So the change in context helps us ask questions about when and why would certain types of mission work for certain types of ventures, right? And that's where an academic mind like yours would be useful to try to tease out the conditions or the context and the boundary conditions that we need to talk about in these discussions. Yeah, thank you. Aprajita?
Yes. Hi, Jerry. Thanks a lot for a very fascinating discussion. I'm looking forward to reading particularly your article on ISR and then, of course, the book, because I'm personally very interested in the role of digital business models in addressing economic development and impact issues. And on that, I was curious to hear about your thoughts on this emerging phenomenon of digital public infrastructure or digital public goods, which is becoming common, like especially in India and then other countries like Africa, where it seems like the flow is in the other direction, where we typically thought of digital technologies being kind of private good. We see these tech players dominating, and now we see the government kind of entering into the space to create a public good around it. Is this like a unique phenomenon particular to a quote unquote emerging countries, or what are your thoughts around kind of this movement in the other direction, so to say?
This is a great question. The digital infrastructure, and many countries now are taking ownership and building out this public infrastructure, right? First, the building out of this is typically done with private enterprise, but the ownership of this rests with the government, right? So even there's this nuance that different countries have had different approaches to how they share ownership of the infrastructure versus ownership of the data versus the regulation of for what conditions by which other private enterprise interface with that data, right? So if I take, let's say, the equivalent of a social security number, then if that becomes the common coordinating reference for all, what kind of interface would the private enterprise need to give to then share this data and that kind of stuff, right? But there is a lot of discussion going on across countries in this. So one model that you might want to look at is Singapore, in which it's created the digital infrastructure in the same way, and provide a lot of public services out of that digital infrastructure, right? If you've not had a chance to look at it, I'd encourage you to look at that example. But you also see how now that they are then progressing to then allow private sectors to improve the efficiency of services being delivered, right? If you remember the graph that I put between public responsibility and private responsibility and the nature of contracts that we have, even within a context like digital infrastructure, there's a range in which they operate. So there's clearly a lot more work to be done to understand under what conditions would something be successful. But the question is, what defines success, right? And that each government defines what its own success metric looks like. So then the goal alignment becomes sort of idiosyncratic to that context, each context.
Yeah,
right?
no, thank you. I'm quite fascinated by, like, I actually maybe 10 years back didn't think of digital being a public good, but it, seeing that evolve is something that I'm quite, and kind of seems to be working well.
Yeah, that's right. But even in the US, for example, the social security services, the entire digital infrastructure is run by private agencies.
Right.
Right. But you just don't know it at this time.
Yeah.
You just think about the US Social Security as being run as a government sort of service, right? But really what underpins it is an entire sort of constellation of service providers across states and across regions, right? Providing the digital infrastructure, the check writing, the verification, the auditing, all of those services are not done by the government itself.
Okay, yeah, makes sense. Thank you very much.
Patricia?
Hi, Professor George. Thank you for your presentation. So my question concerns the academic research and theoretical contributions. So how can we frame the similarities and differences in these different kinds of arrangements to solve grand challenges? For example, we have a sustainable ecosystem with a substantial emerging literature, and we also have the perspective of multi-stakeholder partnerships or alliance. So what are your suggestions to effectively frame them?
Yeah. I'm not sure if you've read one of my articles in AMJ. We wrote an editorial in 2016 on grand challenges, right? So there
No.
where we look at different theoretical perspectives on sort of, it's in the December issue of 2016, on what are the different theoretical approaches to think about sort of grand challenges. The one that I think of more often is this interface. Because I look at the interface between public and private, I think of it as organizational design challenges. And there we talk about coordination, cooperation, mutual knowledge, incentive alignment, communication, sort of these issues that happen because how can you convey what government is thinking and its agenda with what it matches with what a private entity or set of entities can deliver. And so I use an org design perspective more often, right? But you can pick any of these theories. You can talk about stakeholder engagement as a theory and build out an entire sort of agenda of research on this, and it's very important. So this issue of I would say voice. Who gets to be participating in a discussion? Who gets to have more say in defining the outcome? Who adjudicates whether the process of consultation was fair? Right? These are big questions. So whichever lens you take, I think it's important to ask the right question within that lens. Right? So I don't think you should restrict yourself as by the theoretical lens. I think what's more important is look at the phenomenon that you're trying to study, and then get at it from different sort of positions. That would be my approach, right? So don't worry about everybody's talking about different theories and I've got this theory. It doesn't matter at all, as long as you're able to very cleanly and neatly identify a problem and then say, how am I going about explaining that problem in a way it can be solved or addressed? That's what matters most. Right?
Mhm.
If you take the simple question of stakeholder engagement and voice, and you spend 30 years of your career on it, you would have done a good thing. Right? So that really doesn't matter. So I'm hoping I'll spend another 10 years in this org design sort of interface of public-private and see if we can do something about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So my colleagues and I, we have a Journal of Management paper came out this month, January issue of Journal of Management, and there we talk about partnership for I'm going to put that screen back. I think it was the first slide. This one here. So there we're partnering for grand challenges, and there we talk about public-private collaborations and how does org design sort of come and influence that, right? You could take a look at that. And there we talk about different theories and put a research agenda behind it.
Okay.
It's open access. All my papers are open access. So you should be able to
Yeah.
get it. Yeah.
Yes, this is really nice. Lazzarini is also Brazilian, right? Sergio Lazzarini.
No, of course. Lazzarini, apart from him being Brazilian, which is a positive, but he's such a superstar, I tell you. He's one of the smartest co-authors I've worked with. And
Okay, thank you.
He's done this fantastic work on privatization. He's got a book out on privatization, right?
Mhm.
I think that's worth reading for sure. Kabir?
Okay, thank you, Professor.
Yeah,
Thank you, Patricia.
thanks, Professor George, for this insightful discussion. Just two quick questions. One, because public-private partnership has matured as a concept to different extent in different countries, and even within a country, to different maturity into different sectors. For example, in India, you can see in transport, we have many examples, but otherwise in say nuclear energy, we might find very few. So one question, how do you see this contrasting difference evolving or merging as per the developed and developing countries? The second question, will these governments and the ventures, will they join together on their own, or will there be intermediaries, or these intermediaries would be again the big four consulting companies, or some different kind of intermediaries come here and they will catalyze these associations?
Yeah, good. Thanks for both great questions, right? So let me take the first one, right? Public-private partnerships as a literature is 50 years old, right? In 2014, in a journal called Social Science and Medicine, uh, uh, Jens Roerich, who's in University of Bath, Roerich, Lewis, and George, 2014, it's about public-private partnerships in health. And we do an entire review of the literature for about 30 or 40 years, right? And there we talk about the structure of public-private partnerships itself. And the reason why I raised that as a review is because despite all of the things that we talk about, the phenomenon of public-private partnership itself is changing, right? That's the first slide that I put in, because your argument is still the ones that are the large types of partnerships, which are big contracts. Earlier in India, for example, used to be the planning commission and laying of roads, road infrastructure for the what you call the golden quadrilateral and all of those things, right? Then that public-private infrastructure became sort of energy production, right? So coal-powered factories and power generation and so forth. And then it went into shipping and ports and so forth, right? So in India, the range at which public-private partnerships are used is a significant variety, but they're still large partnerships, right? In other countries, you have large and small partnership and a huge variation of these types of interventions, right? So many countries approach it from their own experience. So for example, coupons for food, to pick up food in a grocery store. Those coupons given by government coupons towards specific foods, like let's say you can buy 2 bags of rice, right? So in different countries, they've got different ways of providing those incentives. So what you have though is this variety of interventions of what we call public and private. So now I no longer call it public-private partnership, but instead I call it public-private collaborative arrangements or public-private arrangements, which are not just 30-year big infrastructure projects, but they range from anything from arm's length transactions to coupons, to credit, to investing, co-investment, and so forth, right? So now you see a lot more variety in those arrangements. So that's your first question, right? So in terms of what's happening in this space, and is that changing, and then so forth. Wait, I forgot your second question. What was your second question?
My second question was like, will these, because the nature of the partnership is changing, as we can see the type of players. So will they come together their own, or will there be intermediaries?
Oh, the intermediaries question.
Yeah.
Oh, right. Yeah. So we are seeing all of these. So let's say in the US, for example, the Department of Defense does not invest directly into ventures, but it's funded a separate investment arm that that operates at the interface between public and private, that invests in private enterprise. So in some ways, there is an arm's length transaction into a body. The body then acts as an intermediary. Now that intermediary could be in multiple forms. One example are like the Big Four consulting sort of audit or accounting firms. Possible, right? That's one set of intermediaries. But there are other platform type intermediaries. You could also have social enterprise, NGO type intermediaries, right? So there are different ways in which these operate. Partly because you're still thinking that it's at the federal level, but public-private arrangements could be at the state, could be at the district, it could be at the community level, right? So all the models are different within each level. So the intermediaries also change at each level.
Fair enough. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the clarification. And just one update, because as you mentioned, type of contracts in India had been of bigger nature. Just today only we got that news that one startup, which is developing the first of its kind launch pad in India with ISRO.
Right. So
Right.
that's
So,
good.
yeah.
Yeah. So,
Right.
but the US has been sort of pushing that for about 10 years now, I think.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
So now other countries are also taking that up. Oh,
Yeah.
good, good. Thanks for sharing.
Thanks. Thanks.
Slawomir?
Thank you for sharing these great insights. My question is as follow: how to design governance of business to governance ventures, including incentives and schemes to make them successful?
I don't think there is a simple answer to that. There is a lot of work that is done in this space, right? So you would think of, so your question is just on incentive alignment, right? But you think about it within this broader context of organizational design and sort of look at how do you structure these partnerships or these collaborative arrangements so that incentive alignment and goal alignment happen, right? And there are different types of structures that do that in practice, right? So there are review articles that go into this, including the article that we talked about in sort of from an org design perspective, how you'd address that. So I think it's a much bigger question. I don't think there's a simple answer to that. Okay, looks like there have been plenty of questions, and I know we are beyond the 1 hour mark. Is there anything else?
Jerry, could I just ask one quick question, perhaps?
Sure.
Something you touched on, and I think it's also something you exemplify in many ways, but particularly as you know, acting as a managing director, which means you're not like, you're not within the academia with both feet, so to speak. Could you elaborate on your point about the immersion that you mentioned towards the end of your presentation? And what kind of tips would you give to the junior scholars, and perhaps also some suggestions on what kind of traps they should be on the lookout for?
Yeah. So it's a great question, Brett. Thank you very much for raising it. So our current system, academic system, more in the US, but in Europe is a lot more flexible than it is in the US. The US model for a PhD graduate is really focused on getting an academic job and staying in that academic job for 30 years, right? And some people move assistant professor, associate professor to different universities. Some actually stay in the same university for 30 years. So our challenge is that what in our book we call it river of conformity, right? That all the forces really just take you down this river, this pathway that you just sit and you just go in that same pathway, right? You just flow with everybody else, right? And the challenge with that is that that's because the system does that funneling. Right? And for you, if you want to sort of do something different, you have to expend a lot more effort to break that. So if you do nothing, of course, you have to be productive in writing papers and things like that. That's not what I mean by do nothing. So if you're not going against the sort of typical academic culture, then you're going to stay in that same space for 30, 40 years. So what my approach has been, and what I would suggest is at different breaks in your career and different points in your, need not be assistant to associate or associate to full or beyond, at different points in your life, you could start thinking about an exposure in public systems or in private ventures that interface with public systems, right? So that actual seeking out of that requires effort. Putting yourself out there to be recognized and called upon, access to opportunities is not automatic. Just because you're even if you're a great academic, does not mean you'll get opportunities for public service, right? So you have to consciously make that effort, and many academics do that. I'm gonna, if you think of Fiona Murray, who's an MIT, who's been working with the British government for the past 20 years on their innovation ecosystem, is now chairing the NATO Innovation Fund, or serving on its board or something along those lines. She's active in that, shaping that. And it doesn't happen overnight. She continues her research in technology and so forth, in innovation space as a professor, and then builds that interface over time, right? So it takes conscious effort. I'll give you another example. Ronnie Chatterjee, he ran for election in North Carolina. He's a professor at Duke. He served in the Council of Economic Advisors to the President, was partly responsible for the success of the CHIPS Act. These are all academics, right? So in management space that who actually take that effort to build it out, right? So you can do it, but it takes effort because it's countercultural to the existing setup. The existing setup is the easiest thing for you to do, even though to be excellent at that existing setup is still difficult. It's the normal course of events, right? So you writing papers, getting published, and then and doing all of this is great, but you can also do these other things. But doing that requires effort, putting yourself out there. In my case, I've been involved with ventures all through. At Imperial, working with growth companies to then list them on the stock exchange, London Stock Exchange, creating executive programs that work with these growth ventures. Then when I was became AMJ editor, when I was asked to become AMJ editor, I was already deputy dean, and then at the year after I became AMJ editor, then I was asked to be dean in Singapore. So I had to move countries, do all of these things. So it's not the either or mentality. It's the difficult thing is the both and mentality in how we think about it, right? So I don't, it takes a lot more effort to do the both and rather than the either or. And the easiest is to do the either or, right? So putting yourself out there, actively thinking and cultivating it, and thinking of your career more holistically in a way that sort of says it's more than just writing and research. It's impact in different ways. It's also impact in a way that it makes you think about it differently, think about a phenomena differently when you're engaged in conversations on both sides, right? So hopefully that's useful. Maybe it was a bit of blabbering, but hope that gets everybody enthused about this idea that we're looking at. There are others. There are plenty of others in the academy who are working in this space, and they're all fantastic people, right? So I've co-authored with many of them, some of them. But this idea is that the way we think about academic careers can be different, and but it takes effort for you to make it different, and to be rewarded in that, it takes effort. Okay, with that, I'll close. So thank you very much, everybody. It's been such a joy being here and talking to everybody. I hope you got something out of it. I'm always reachable by email. You just Google me and you can send it to my Georgetown email, right? So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.